Good evening, everybody. Welcome. For everyone who's gathered in our space tonight, in our sanctuary, welcome. We're so glad you're here. My name is Joan Halpoulis. I'm the Director of Justice Ministries here at Pax Christi. And a warm welcome to everybody. If everybody in the space would kindly take your devices and make sure it's set to silent, we'd really appreciate that. And then for those of you who are joining by live stream, welcome. We're so glad you're with us and that our technology is working. We'd like to make you aware that you will be able to offer questions at the time for questions and answers through the chat function. We'll make sure you get heard in the space. And if you slide down, there's a button that will give you the justice materials for tonight, justice speaker materials. All of the handouts will be right there, so you can click on that. There's a PDF that comes up so you can participate with the handouts at home. And with that, I will welcome Mary up.
Thanks, Joan. Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Lanners, and I am chair of the Pax Christi Justice Council. It is my honor to introduce our speaker tonight, who will help us unpack the doctrine of discovery. Jessica Intermill is a land history consultant with over 15 years of experience as a treaty rights and tribal law attorney. She helps individuals and organizations look underneath their homes, schools, businesses, and congregations to understand the circumstances that form the history of the land they stand on. As a strategic policy consultant for Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, Jessica also works to engage congregations in the work of reparations and reparatory action. Jessica, welcome to Pax Christi. We are so glad you accepted our invitation to guide us in this important conversation. Thank you.
Joan, Mary, thank you both so much for inviting me to be here, and thank you all for inviting me into your space to share time with you, to share learning with you, and to share what's not a fun topic, but it's a really important one. So, let's dig in. As Mary mentioned, I am a trained attorney. I've been practicing federal Indian law, and that's the word that the United States gives to the subject, for more than 15 years, and most of that time I've spent as a treaty litigator. That means that on behalf of my tribal clients, I go to court, often to United States court, and ask the United States to enforce its treaty promises that most of the times states have broken. That work has taught me three things. First, it brought me into relationship with tribal leaders who showed me a whole other side of history that I was never taught. Second, it taught me how to read treaties, which is a very strange party skill, but it is one that has served me well and that is an important one for some of the things we're going to talk about tonight. The third thing that it did is teach me that the courts are not all that they're cracked up to be. Especially when it comes to enforcing treaty rights. That's when I started doing land history consulting. What I do in that capacity is help individuals and organizations learn the political history of the land they stand on and place our present selves in the stream of that history. Because when we do that, when we see how we are affected by the past, we can make better informed choices about going forward. I do this work with Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. I also work directly with congregations like yours. And tonight, we're going to do a little bit of that work in a little bit broader context when we talk about the doctrine of discovery. Now, I'm going to assume that most of you have seen the movie. All right, I'm seeing heads nod, that's good. If you haven't watched it, please do. But we will sort of do a brief recap for folks who have not had a chance to yet. So as you've sort of come in and you're settling into your space, into your body, settling into your chair, I'd invite you to pick up, did everybody get pens to go with your maps? All right, I think we need to pass around some pens. As we talk, oh, I'm gonna wait for the pens. For those at home, this will be, the handout looks like a map of Minnesota, but with some sort of patchwork lines going through the state. But if you're at home, I invite you to pull up that map and also take a look. So as folks are getting back to their chairs with their pens, what I invite you to do is take a look at this map and start marking places that are important to you. So put a little dot for your house. Maybe if you have a favorite cabin that you like to go to, mark that down. A family farm. Maybe your grandparents' house. Maybe a vacation place up at the North Shore or somewhere else. Think about the places in Minnesota that shaped you. And as we're talking tonight, feel free to return to this and sort of, make a little star or a little heart or a little dot wherever those places are that are important to you. We'll come back to this in a different point. But before we start going really deeply into the doctrine of discovery, I want to tell you all a story from one of my treaty cases. So, treaty case, we had a question about whether there were actually two treaties right in a row, like just days apart. The first treaty was super detailed. The second one on the same subject but with different tribes was much less detailed and basically said, like we said over at the first one. And we were like, well, that's weird, but it would make sense if people who were at the first treaty council made it to the second treaty council. So say the second treaty's tribal leaders was at the first council, then it'd be really easy to shorthand back. So we're trying to sort of put the historical record back together and figure out, was the first one, could they have been there and could they have gotten to the second one in time for that second treaty? And I'm like, well, sure they could, right? Like you just get on your horse and you ride for the day or two and you're good. You totally make it in time. And my supervising attorney, because I was a pretty young attorney at the time, said, Jess, we're talking about Michigan, the forests of Michigan. Nobody's riding horses through the forests of Michigan. And I was like, oh, I grew up in Kansas and Nebraska. I didn't know what I didn't know. And I give you, do I have a clicky thing? I just realized I don't have a clicky thing. We're gonna talk to Hannah. All right, clicky thing. Perfect. What I realized is that we have lenses that we bring to things. And we're going to practice switching some of those lenses tonight. Take a look at the slide that we just put up. What I want to show you is that how we think about something and what lens we're using can influence what you see. And changing the lens can change that experience. So for example, if you look up here, you'll see, and it's probably easier to see for the folks at home, you'll see a general. But what if I told you that there are 9 people in that image? And now you're looking for the 9 people, right? Because we switched the lens. It hadn't occurred to me when I was at that treaty, in that treaty meeting, that there could be any other lens, let alone that my lens was so unhelpful that it was obscuring what I could do for my client. So as we go throughout, we're going to do much more interaction than I usually do. So I'm like really excited to talk with you guys. But I'll warm us up a little bit. The doctrine of discovery is a phrase that might be new to you, but its concepts are familiar. We just know it from a different frame. And so if we go to the next slide, how many folks are familiar with this image? We've got a couple of hands raising here. All right. This is called American Progress. In the center, you have the goddess or angel, there's different descriptions, who's named Columbia. Again, it's going to be easier to see for folks at home, but she has a star right on her sort of tiara that's called the Star of Empire. If you read, you can kind of read the picture from right to left. You'll see it moves from light to darkness. On the right side, there are European ships, industry, control of land is good. You see trains, you see a telegraph, you see farming. As you move left of Columbia, you see darkness. Indigenous folks are fairly blatantly equated with animals. They are equivalent to the bear in the picture. And the only raised weapon in the entire picture is one indigenous person raising a hatchet. Now, this is the frame that I was taught growing up. But how does it affect your viewing of this picture right now if I tell you that the reason this picture or this painting was created was to sell guidebooks to the West in the 1800s? This is a propaganda piece. In 1850, the total US Census data for the state of Minnesota was 6,000 people. 6, that's it. By 1870 to 1880, in that decade, the Norwegian population of Minnesota alone grew from 50,000 to 120,000. So in the time that this piece is being circulated very widely as an invitation for white settlers, white colonizers to come to the West, it works. There's a ton of people who come in and use this frame while they do it. Let's go to the next slide. The film that we saw gave us new language and new knowledge from a different perspective. It uses a different lens. And I'm going to ask for a little bit of audience interaction here and a microphone to kind of pop up, because I'm going to make you guys do some of the work. What is the doctrine of discovery?
If you discover something, then you get to be dominant.
Excellent, excellent. And when is this doctrine from? How old is it?
Back to a papal bull of 1491.
1493, there's a papal bull. There's one earlier than that. And the doctrine itself, that was sort of when it was codified, made into law. The doctrine itself goes back to the Crusades. It's very closely tied to the spread of Christianity and the spread of Christianity by violence. So you talked about it's from the papal bulls. Why did the Pope issue these bulls? Anyone have any ideas? The film did not exactly talk about this. Oh, we've got one.
Spread Christianity?
Christianity was already spreading. It was to settle a beef between Portugal and Spain. Portugal had been engaged in the spice trade. It was really deeply colonizing and extracting from the Eastern Hemisphere. And the first of the two papal bulls says, yeah, okay, that, go ahead, go do that, Portugal. That's, enslave folks, go for it. The second one comes in 1493 because Columbus, thinking he went to India, landed in the Americas, and the Pope basically, to keep Spain and Portugal from going after each other, says, okay, we're going to keep doing the doctrine of discovery. Spain, you get the Western Hemisphere. Portugal, you get the Eastern Hemisphere. Fast forward to today, which hemisphere speaks Spanish? The Western. Because of these decisions that the Pope tried to mediate between countries. I'm going to keep checking my watch because I'm going to try to time things. But before we keep going, I'm wondering if anyone is willing to say why or whether the doctrine of discovery is relevant to your life today. Anyone? All right, Joan, go for it. Or Mary, sorry.
Because the laws are still on the books. The laws are still on the books.
The laws are still on the books today. And that's where we're going to go next. We're going to start diving in. It's really, really old, or really, really easy to say, well, these don't matter because they're old. That was a different time. Those ideas are outdated. As a judge said in one of my cases, these ideas have grown hoary with age. I did not even know that word before he used it. But if we go to the next slide, we don't throw things away just because they're old. There are plenty of old things that stay in our life that we continue to value and incorporate. But it's also too easy to say that the past is past. We still sing Gloria at Mass today. It's from the 300s. The Council of Nicaea, which decided that, yeah, we're going to go with the Holy Trinity, that was 325 BC and is obviously still very relevant today. It's a central tenet, just as it has been for the last 600 years. But if these things are familiar to us, why isn't the doctrine of discovery familiar? So as we pause tonight and reconsider how we frame history, I also want to invite you to reconsider how we frame time, because now is always. The past is present in our places and it is present in us. If we go to the next slide, this is not a particularly new idea, right? Like Faulkner told us that the past is never past. It comes up in a lot of different contexts. But if your elementary school education was like mine, we were taught that time is linear. Events occur at one point in time. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now is fundamentally separate from then in this conception of time. So the slide that we have up talks about there's the American Revolution, and then there's slavery, and then there's westward expansion, and then there's the Civil War. But life is so much messier than that. Chattel slavery began on this continent 150 years before the Revolution. And it was part of westward expansion. And the Dakota War happened because, and in some way, during the Civil War, and in some ways because of the Civil War, because the United States had committed resources to the Dakota in the treaties, but then it went into a civil war and had to go fight a war, and that was expensive, so it didn't pay on the treaties, and that caused the starvation that caused the US-Dakota War. They're all tied together. The topics don't say in their separate lenses that that historical conception of time is not true, not just because the legal and cultural and economic effects linger, although of course they do. It's also because our physical landscape has within it everything that came before. And if we go back one more, please, or actually backward, there we go. So what I'd invite you to consider today is to think of time differently. That standing here today, all of this is true, all at once. The revolution is here because we are in the United States. Minnesota wouldn't be here without that. Westward expansion is here. the Twin Cities Metro, because in 1805, Lieutenant Pike went up the river and said, man, that'd be a good place for a fort. That's here now. The legacy of slavery at that fort is still here. The United States actually paid stipends to their officers to keep slaves in a free state. The Civil War is here because if that U.S.-Dakota War hadn't happened, if all of those pieces had not fit together, Minnesota would not be the Minnesota that it is today. And so now if we go to the next slide, we think about it's not just that history builds on itself, it's that we stand in all of history at once. All of those things are how the United States secured the right for all of us to be here today. All of them are true. And I'm going to pause again and ask for folks, I'm going to ask for microphone help again. We're going to break in just a sec to go and find some cookies. But first, I want to pause and ask you to reflect on how does this idea of time strike you? Is it new? Is it familiar at all? Is it entirely different than what you've thought of before?
I actually started to think about this watching the Doctrine of Discovery because it occurred to me that many of the laws that are still on the books today are built on a foundation of sand. And, that's our law and we're stuck with it until we can figure out how to undo it.
Exactly, right? Like you can live in the house and not even know that the foundation is rotten. But that rotten foundation's still there. How does it feel to stand in the current of history and to think about holding all of those pieces at once? We'll come back to that. Oh, wait, we've got Richard up front. The folks on the live stream are like, phew, she's not calling on me.
Well, I think for me, I'm fortunate to, when I grew up in the history we studied, it was all about white people in college and what have you. So I'm very thankful now to be hearing the other side, to hearing the complete history. And it's complicated, certainly. And one of the things is you talk about, are we living in is this still alive today? These treaties you're trying to get some of these enforced now. I know that. So yes, we're living, that is relevant to today.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, I tend to understand that treaties are relevant because, it's my job, but I've heard I've actually gone into a room full of Indigenous high school students, because I used to teach a moot court with them, and we asked them if they had any treaty rights, or why treaties matter today, and they're like, they don't, because we're so far divorced from that. We have another comment over here, question?
How matakiapi? Washichu ya William Conradi makiapi do. Bede ote atunwe imacha gado. Dama kodashni. Hello, my relatives. English people call me William Conradi. I go as Bill. My Dakota teachers taught me that is the way to introduce myself. They are Neil and Monica McKay, and they are by far better teachers than I am a student, but they're very patient and kind. My wife and I took some Dakota language studies under them together recently. It took me till I was 60. I've lived in Dakota country all my life. It took me 60 years to figure out that I can learn the language. So in terms of the question about the history, it's now. It's right now. We are standing in Dakota country. This church is in Dakota country. For me, it's very exciting to know that fact and to know that what good hosts my Dakota friends are and how patient, kind they are, and generous with me. So I just want to make that alive and active in this space. I won't take too much time, but I'm thrilled that we're having the conversation, and your question really enlivens me. And so I thank you for the opportunity to speak to that.
Thank you.
That's my form of acknowledgement about where we are. And any day I speak Dakota in Dakota country is a better day than the days I don't. So, thank you.
Thank you for bringing that into this space, Bill. I think that's a really good place for us to take a very quick break. We have some snacks and coffee, and I want to give you a chance to stretch your legs a little bit before we go into the uglier side of things. So let's meet back in 5 minutes. All right, everybody is coming back in and settling back. We have a second handout for folks to look at. So if you're at home, what we're going to take a look at is the handout that says Papal Bulls at the top. And let everybody sort of settle back in and take a look at the handout. What it is just a snapshot of some of the pieces from these papal bulls that have occurred over time. And I tried to bold some language in there to make it easier to read, because it turns out that reading translated Latin is not super digestible. But I wanted to give you this because a lot of these were quoted in the movie, but it's hard to hold them. And this gives you a chance to revisit them and come back to them and maybe think and dive in a little bit more. As you take a look at these, I want you to pause and take a breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. And before we go deeper into the material, I'd invite you to sort of scan your body and notice, are there any muscles that are tight? Are there any physical sensations that stand out? Are you maybe holding your jaw firmly, or is your brow a little bit crinkled, or are your shoulders up? Are your arms crossed? Take another breath. Release your jaw. Allow your eyebrows to soften. Uncross any arms and put both feet on the floor. And feel the ground beneath you supporting you. Notice your chair supporting your weight. And notice that you can have a physical reaction to this material, and you can address that reaction with your breath. You can breathe into those tight spots. And what that allows you to do is to keep working and keep learning and keep leaning in without sort of pushing back, right? Because that physical reaction that we sometimes have to material like this will keep us distanced from it. And that does not serve us. So that breathing exercise and just sort of a quick body scan and let everything go loose is what will help us keep going. If you find that feeling coming back at any point where you're just kind of like, ugh, I invite you to do that same thing in your chair. I might, if I notice it, invite us to do the same. And I just want to acknowledge out loud, this is hard. This is not what we learned, and learning it as adults is hard. And we can do hard things. So, what stands out to you, and we're going to do a little bit more discussion in the group again, what stands out to you about the language of these papal bulls? Any first reactions? So we had somebody yell out the violence of the bulls. Isn't that such a contrast from the American Progress picture, right? Like, we're like, no, it's noble. We're just plowshares. It's great. This is the foundation. This is what's actually happening. What else do you notice? A righteousness. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, it's, of course we get to do this. I'm the Pope. This is what we do. Now, granted, at this time, the Pope pretty much was a leading legal authority, and at least in the colony or the colonial powers. And so that would have made sense to him that he gets to do that. But there's an arrogance too, right? That like, oh, I get to do this for the whole globe. And what does that mean about how he saw the people that he was directing enslavement of and directing conquer of? What does that tell you? Less than human. The people who he's talking about are less than human. Now how does that line up with American Progress? That idea carried through, right? If you look super closely at the American Progress painting, you'll see there are skeletons of buffalo that are sort of scattered around. So you have the bison, you have the indigenous people, you have the bear, right? They're all alike. And look, we've got skeletons. So those are those first reactions. What does your brain tell you about these reactions? Like, what does this bring up for you? Crazy? Do we have, I'm going to ask for a microphone because I'm going to ask folks to really kind of like dig in on these ones and not go one words. We're going to put in our steps today.
Just feels like if we go very far to think about less than human, there's so much of that happening in our world today about feeling and being the other and less than human.
And where do you see that happening today? Tell me more.
Well, I think of George Floyd for one. I mean, that was treated less than human. Yeah. I think of the people at the borders who are being treated less than human. I think about the children in our inner city schools who are being treated less than human in terms of who their teachers are, what their food is, that they are in food deserts.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Got another comment over here.
The LBGQ population, I think we're seeing that more and more as far as violence toward that community. Really anybody that we perceive as being a little different than us, whoever we are, we feel we have a right of superiority and we're the ups and there's the downs, so to speak.
So I'm going to dig into that we. You said whoever we are. Is it any we or is it a specific we who does this? So is it anybody who's, so the answer was it's anybody who's in your circle as we, but do groups who are not predominantly white settler colonizers do this? Or when we talk about we exclude people who are not like us, are we talking about white people? That's my hypothetical question. I won't make you answer it. I'll answer it. I think it's a trait of white supremacy culture to say, well, we're the we, right? That's what the Pope said. We're the we. For a long time, it was white or European Christianity is the we. And we can see that continues today. That continued on the neck of George Floyd. That continues in the violent legislation against trans kids. And does it also continue against indigenous communities? Let's talk more about that. Who wants to talk about that? About how does that violence of white supremacy and that, us versus them continue today when we consider indigenous communities?
The missing and murdered indigenous women, for one thing.
So missing and murdered indigenous women is definitely something that is a huge issue. For folks who are not familiar, the rates of rape and kidnapping and murder of Native women is ridiculously higher than just about any other population. And part of the reason for that is there's some gaps in laws that happen under federal Indian law, but also, might it be that the police just don't care as much about Native girls? We also just started in Minnesota, we're working on a task force for missing and murdered black women as well, because it's the same thing, right? It's that same white supremacy.
was something on the news hour last night about, or the night before about, I think it was, I don't remember if it was Hispanic, it was Latino women. Different non-white people suffer more and aren't seen or noticed as missing or heard as missing as much as we white. It was Latino. Thank you.
Well, and that's absolutely true that we, if I report my blonde kid, my cute little girl missing, then the police will believe me and they will go find her. And we still have these pervasive hangovers from the doctrine of discovery that tell us, well, maybe that brown kid was just out on a bender and you know them, right? Like it is, when we look at it with, full face, it is ridiculous. And it continues.
Healthcare for indigenous women, indigenous people. The doctors do not respect their opinions, and the death rate in pregnancies of indigenous and black women is so much higher than white.
That is absolutely true. The maternal mortality rates are tremendous. Got another in the back here.
Yeah, I think a big example is the way people were treated when they were protesting the pipeline. The water
Yes.
cannons in the middle of winter, people, being shot at directly with tear gas grenades and other projectiles.
Yeah, so during the Standing Rock protests especially, but also in the Line 3 protests, the water protectors faced not just violence, but state violence. The state of Minnesota paid for the security forces to act so aggressively and so violently towards people. So we have a mixed crowd, but for the Catholics in the group, my question to you is, how does it feel in your heart to hold this tradition? To know that it comes from the same place you come from, right? Because we can look at this and we can see it and we can say, oh, that's wrong. But how does it feel? Where do you feel it in your body? Embarrassing. Ashamed. Guilt. Yeah. And that's, those are hard, right? And especially when we talk about shame, which I think embarrassment is like right there, and guilt too, right? So I'm just going to sort of wrap them all together in shame. What I would invite you to do is to look at it, see that it's there, put it over here. Because shame is a I am bad sort of emotion. And that is the kind of thing that's going to shut you down, and you're not going to do any more work, and we're not going to have any more conversations, and I want to continue this conversation, so I need you in it. So instead, if you can look at it with remorse, it's not that you are bad, it is that a bad thing was done for you. Then that's going to help you continue in this work. And it also invites the question, do you want this done in your name? And I'm going to expand that out from the Catholics to the white folks too, right? All of us. We'll keep that we going. Do we want this in our name? Because that's what's going to keep us at the next meeting and the next action and the next, how do we fix this? Because it is broken. Even though we're not the ones who broke it, we're the ones who can fix it. And so shifting from the I am bad to bad things were done for me is how we're going to keep going. I'm going to ask us to distribute the next handout. This is our third handout, and it is similar to that second one, except that it is about U.S. law. It's talking about how the doctrine of discovery continues today here. Basically, we're going to go forward 400 years, fast forward to 1863, and if we can go ahead and get the PowerPoint back up, we're going to talk about Johnson v. McIntosh, sometimes also called Johnson versus Graham's lessee. And I have a typo in the PowerPoint. Look at that. It should say 1863. It is not 186. This is a case that is standard fare required coursework in American property law classes. Like, I learned about this one in our first year of law school. The case that happened is that a man named Thomas Johnson bought land from the Pinkeshaw tribe. But later on, the United States sold rights to the same land to William McIntosh. The question then is, who gets the land? Was it the guy who bought the land from the tribe first, or the one who bought it from the United States second? If we go to the next slide, we'll see that discovery is key. This is Chief Justice John Marshall, who is one of our renowned jurists. He's like one of the giants that you hear about in law school. And if we see, he really said, let's go. So on the discovery of the immense continent, it was only natural that these Europeans wanted to appropriate it all for themselves. On the next slide, we'll see, how could they not, right? Those indigenous folks weren't human. It affords an apology. Okay, first of all, you don't need an apology if you didn't do anything wrong, but here we are. But the superior genius of Europe had to claim ascendancy. They had to. That was the only thing they could do. You can't just leave it to those animals, right? And there's some awful language that goes through a whole lot of court cases that talks about savagery and the occupation of war. Okay, again, which conquistadors had war as an occupation, and where did they land? It's like the projection is ridiculous in these things. But the Europeans had to take it. So because the Europeans had to take it, they gained legal title. The Europeans got that title to the United States. The tribes had nothing left to grant Mr. Johnson because the Europeans were already ascendant. They were already superior, already dominant. And that's your domination code. The guy who bought it second got the land because he bought it from the white folks. So we're going to pause there and go back to that idea that history is stacked. Because we do still live this history today. This is still operative good law. It is the foundation of all U.S. property law. So I'm going to come back again to that question of why does the doctrine of discovery matter now? Why do we care now? Seeing that this is our law stacked on top of the doctrine of discovery, tell me what you're thinking. Take a breath if you need to.
So I'm thinking that justice isn't possible when the law is built on something that's unjust. It's not possible to have a justice system that's actually working as we hope for to create justice on top of injustice that was the original sin of it.
Yeah. So you see why I started land history consulting, right? The Justice John Marshall, in this opinion, actually calls the United States courts the courts of the conqueror. Now, and he says it like that's totally fine, right? But that continues, absolutely, today. How else are you connecting this to your life right now?
White privilege and how we are really taking a look at ourselves more today because of circumstances that have been happening around us. And we take a look at what that white privilege really means. And if we don't understand that we have white privilege, then we can't understand how other people have been so badly mistreated, given the power we think we yield and in our treaties and our laws. And so, those are things that just are so striking to me. And we think, now what is white privilege? I mean, I'm just living my life. And I think if we examine our lives, we can find things that put us above and beyond what other people in similar circumstances that aren't white don't have to deal with. And, we talk about how people of color have to have the talk with their kids. You don't want to get stopped by the police. I tend to try to make time on the road when I'm driving. I get stopped. The last time I was stopped, I was pulled over by a highway patrol woman, and she said, "You know how fast you're going?" And I did say, "Yeah, I was in a hurry. I'm really sorry about that." And she said, "Well, I'm going to just warn you. Now, I want you to be safe, and let me go."
Mm-hmm.
Now, that wouldn't have happened if I was a woman of color, if I was driving maybe a older car. Those are the kinds of things, that treatment that we might get just because of how we look. And we have to really wrap our minds around that to understand how our lives have been those of privilege at the cost of other people.
Yeah, the woman who sort of first identified or described white privilege called it an invisible knapsack. It's these tools that you sort of bring with you even though you don't know they're there. And absolutely, the doctrine of discovery and what it does for land ownership is right there in that pack. Another comment back here. I think on the edge, you had a hand up. Can't remember what she was going to say. That is okay.
I just have a question just popped into my mind, and it was like, eminent domain. That just popped into my mind, and I thought about the Rondo neighborhood, that they just took and decimated that community. And I thought, we still have eminent domain, correct?
We do.
So, just that attitude of that someone can take someone else's home, maybe give them something for it, but you can't recreate a community. So I think even that today is still at play in how we see property or who owns it.
Absolutely. And in the case of eminent domain, it's not that someone can take it. Originally, the doctrine is that the king can take it. It's good to be the king. Because then it's like, oh, it's good for everyone, right? Like the king is a benevolent leader who has everybody's rights in mind. Maybe. But there's some really good reason. There's actually some initiatives in St. Paul right now to do reparations and reparatory work for people. There's a couple different ones, but especially for folks who were displaced by the Rondo taking, to sort of try to compensate that in part, because of course it destroyed a community and it took that community's wealth and it was pretty specific about whose community it affected, right? Like the same thing happened in Minneapolis, or similar thing happened in Minneapolis. What is now Olson Memorial Highway was supposed to run through Northeast Minneapolis. And Northeasters said no, and the city listened and put it through North Side. I think we have one more question here.
Yeah, so the thing I think about the way that domination perpetuates itself is what's killing our planet.
Yeah. Yeah, so often when I'm speaking with MNIPL, the question that I get is, why is a climate organization talking reparations? But these same systems of oppression, white supremacy and Christian supremacy, that separated people from the earth, also separated people from each other. And one of the things that is really remarkable is that the more I talk about and practice reparations and teach about this, the more joy I find in reconnection. And this is obviously very heavy material, and there can be a ton of joy, and I think joy is really in reconnecting and finding our collective liberation. You know, it's really strange to say I really like giving away 10% of my consulting income before any expenses, but I do, because that's how I can reconnect and pay back the pieces that were taken for me, right? It's not a charity. It's not it's what I have left over, so I'll share. It's me paying back my debt, and that feels good. If we go back to the slides, we're going to go forward in time another 150 years to the case of Oneida Nation versus City of Sherrill. Now, in this case, the question was whether a particular piece of land would be considered Indian country. This is a federal term that means that the tribe would have jurisdiction over tribal members on this parcel. There's some very limited ways that it could have jurisdiction over non-members, but for the most part, tribes do not have a ton of jurisdiction over their members. I do not understand what is happening to the last number of each of these, but it was 2003, I think. So in this case, if the courts had followed like all of federal Indian law precedent, then the case would have come out the way that the Second Circuit Court of Appeals said, which is that the Oneida Nation had jurisdiction over this piece of land. But at the Supreme Court, there's a different decision, and Justice Ginsburg writes for the majority. If we go to the next slide, we see that existing US law cannot get around this case, the law that existed before this particular case. And so instead, Justice Ginsburg says, well, we got to go back to the doctrine of discovery, right? We're going to go all the way back. This is a case that came out like while I was in law school. And she says, we're going back to it. We're going to pull from before, and we see that fee title, ownership, is vested in the sovereign. And on the next slide, she says, first that was the Europeans, then it was the US. Where have we heard this before? This is exactly Justice Marshall in the Johnson v. McIntosh case. On the next slide, she says, there's that law that should control this case, but we have to look at the long history of sovereign control. All the stuff that came before that's not law. And on the next slide, she says that stuff is the justifiable expectations, grounded in 2 centuries of New York and New Yorkers thinking that they lived here and that there was no tribal jurisdiction. Now pause on that one. Whose expectations? It's not the expectations of anyone who was paying attention to federal Indian law before this case, because it was an easy case before this case, and the expectations would have been that the court would have followed the law, and it would have been Indian country that has tribal jurisdiction. And she doesn't say whose expectations. That's silent, but it's in the we, right? We're talking white folks. The next slide. We see that long lapse of time and those white folks' expectations, it would just be, this is so different from when those were not going to say the S word roamed New York, and it would be too disruptive to follow the law. So we make a new one. And now this case is out there, and it is a new and exciting roadblock to tribes that try to assert jurisdiction. So bring those ideas a little closer to home, because again, this is good law. This is the United States right now. This is governing. On the next slide, when we think about why do we care and bring it home, this is what the doctrine of discovery looks like. Look at the Father Hennepin in the dominant position. He is the one who gets to talk to God. He is the one who gets to decide what the rules are. I have no idea why the woman is not wearing a shirt. That's just a really weird feature of this. It is not something at all. But it shows not just that the doctrine of discovery continues, but this particular painting, created in 1905, about an event that happened in 1680, shows how clearly that doctrine of discovery and the white supremacy and Christian supremacy that is all wrapped up with it continued into 1908, continued past the 70s-ish American progress. And who knows where this painting is right now? It's in the state capitol. Where in the state capitol? It was actually in the governor's reception room, next to a second painting that depicts the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux. That one, again, you could totally see the domination code, right? You could see the U.S. treaty negotiator at the table and all sorts of, Superman pose, whatever. And then you've got all of the indigenous people down on the floor in front of him, right? You see the same ascendancy. The scale of these murals, okay, so it's the size of the screen, both of them. It covers the whole giant wall. And when Lieutenant Governor Flanagan was elected, she said, I can't bring my daughter to work when this is up here. I can't. So they moved it to the third floor of the Capitol and added some contextualization of so here's why these might not be great. And there is still plenty of awful, awful iconography throughout the Minnesota Capitol. When I was at in the House chambers for the vote on whether to strengthen Minnesota's version of the Indian Child Welfare Act, I think it's a frieze that's right above the speaker has, you have that same sort of idea, much like American Progress, where you have the white liberty in the middle, and you have on the one side pioneers, and on the other side indigenous people, and it's pretty clear who she's rooting for. So we talk white privilege, but it's also, this is what structural racism looks like, right? Structural racism in our structures, right? In the frescoes and in our laws. And now I'm going to invite you to bring back out that map that we started with. This is a map that a man named Charles Royce created in 1890 something. He actually created them for the entire United States. And what it is he has mapped every treaty area. We call them treaty sessions, C-E-S-S-I-O-N, so that you can see what area connects to which treaty. So every area on this map is one that the United States acquired in exchange for a promise. Every section has a different story about how the United States broke those promises. But even though the United States broke those promises, it didn't give the land back. Now, this is different than most US law. Under most, like just contract law, if the contract that I entered into is so grossly disproportionate in power, which US courts have held that many of these are, then you undo the contract. It's just like, you know what, it's like that contract was never there. But even though US courts have found that these were tremendously unfair bargaining situations and theft, sometimes outright theft, the United States didn't have to give it back. But that's the doctrine of discovery, right? Like, that's the domination code. It's ours. We take it. We aggregate it. We acquire it. We couldn't help it. We couldn't help it. That's just what we do. And on the next slide, when you think about that map that you're holding and look at those places that shaped you, look at what's important to you. Think about that stacked history. The doctrine of discovery told colonizers and settlers, and that's every one of us in this room and online, unless you're indigenous, told us that this land is ours. That's the lens we use every day when we unlock the door to our house. That's the lens that we use when we visit the Capitol. That's the lens that we use when we come here to worship. This is our worship center. It's ours. We are all relying on that doctrine of discovery right now. So, while it is true that our country was built on crusade dogma and a theology of racism, that's not past. That's right here. Our literal houses are built on the foundation that it is white Christians' job to go out and occupy, and maybe take some slaves while you're out there. And all of that is true right now, even though the church says that this is not a problem anymore. Let's go to the next slide. Now, nothing has ever formally undone the doctrine of discovery. The Catholic Church has never expressly undone it. But the Holy See ambassador to the United Nations in 2010 wrote a letter, basically said, okay, UN, we get that this is kind of gross. And it actually started, but first of all, that doctrine is totally undone because Spain and Portugal started violating it like right away. Like 1494, they were out there fighting with each other again, so it didn't really do anything anyway. We don't have to deal with it. And even if that weren't true, we have said that forced conversions are bad and we shouldn't do that. And we've said that slavery is bad. So we've really undone the doctrine of discovery. We don't need to formally repeal it because we have these other things sitting on top of it. And oh, by the way, we're going to tell the UN now that even though in the time that it took us to get to those points, countries incorporated this doctrine as their law, Well, that's their problem now. That's their precedent. That's not ours. We're done. We walked away from that. And the next slide. It has no value for us whatsoever. We're totally done with the doctrine. Next slide. It is now up to the legislators of those countries, to their governments, to legal historians. It is up to them to undo the doctrine of discovery. So we're in a popular democracy. I would submit that it's now up to you to undo the doctrine of discovery. And the next slide. If it is true that history, all of history, lives in us in our places right now, is it not also true that we right now have a foot in tomorrow? Like, this is the premise of basically every time travel question ever, is that if you go back in time and you mess anything up, then all of a sudden the whole of history has changed. Well, can we not do that now for next time? Right? Can we make those small changes now? Because it's so easy to look at this and be like, you guys, that's like papal bowls, and did you see the hats? And this is like way beyond our pay grade. But we have the power to make these changes. So that's the question that I'll leave you with. Now that you have seen the 9 people that are in the general, now that you realize we're not on the plains and we're in the forests, and so the horse is probably not going to help that much, right? Like, now that you have used this new lens, what do? You can't change what was done before in your name, for you, in the name of your Lord. But you decide what's next for you. And so that's where I want to end our conversation, is with first some exploration of what does that mean for you right now, and then some ideas of where we might go next. So let's go back to the microphone. What are folks thinking and feeling right now?
The ride that the Native people take from the Dakotas to Mankato.
Oh, the 38.
And during that trip, that ride, they talk about how they need to forgive and how they reflect upon letting go of anger and hostility. And I was so taken with that they were the ones that were trying to let go of those negative emotions to live a better life. That leaves us with your question. We're the ones that should be asking for forgiveness, and they're the ones that are trying to be the ones to forgive. And so if we're the ones that are asking, what do we need to do? It seems like we need to work with the communities and ask them what we need to do, because how could we possibly know? What are the expectations? And I think that's where I land, is trying to find that out.
Yeah, that is a fantastically important point, right? Because so much of the doctrine of discovery and the history of Christianity in the United States is telling indigenous people what they need to be civilized. Well, we're going to tell you that you have to go live in houses and plant your farms in straight rows. This is an actual thing that happened here on the, can't remember if the settlement was on Lake Harriet or Bedemakaska, but there was a group of Dakota who, in order to try to not be removed, started farming near the missionary's house. And there's a map that shows these fields that follow the terrain of the land. So they're not square, right? There's like triangles and rhombuses and the letters of this missionary, it drove him nuts. He's like, why can't they go in lines? They don't need to, right? Right. So we need to ask what makes sense to the communities who we have hurt, who we have harmed. And it's not to ask for me, it's not to ask for forgiveness, because that's not up to me, right? Whether someone decides to forgive me or not, or to forgive my history or not, is up to them, right? That's what the writers are doing. What I want to know is, how can I fix what was broken for me? And so for that, one of the answers that I hear a lot when I talk with Indigenous folks is land back, right? Like, what would it look like for a person to surrender the family farm? What would it look like for a church to surrender the worship space? And maybe one of the things that gets kind of interesting here is there's different ways to do that, right? Like, at the one end of the spectrum, it's like, no, we're not going to talk about that. That doesn't even make sense. We can't do that. Other end of the spectrum is, I totally believe everything Jessica said. Here, have the keys to the castle. And I walk away. In between, there is a lot of room for things like gifting the land to a tribe with a lease back, so that for a period of time, the congregation can continue to worship in the place. Or it could be something like sharing office space with an Indigenous organization that rent-free would continue in. Timeout heads up on that there might not be an Indigenous organization who wants to go into a Catholic church, right? So you need to have that conversation. But there's a lot of room for how can I do the thing you ask me to do. What I would encourage you not to do once you've asked that question, because it's such an important question, is to not listen to the answer, right? Because it's so easy, especially when we're talking about land, because land is like memory, it's living, it's part of us. It's so easy to be like, yeah, but we can't do that. Can't you? How could we talk about that? What else is bubbling up for you?
Well, you talked about the spreading Christianity, the Europeans coming spreading Christianity. It wasn't Christian. We need to face that. It was a distortion of the gospel, distortion of what Jesus taught. Yeah. If you look at the story of the Good Samaritan and all that, welcome the stranger. So this wasn't Christian. The church needs to face that, first of all, in my opinion.
So you say that the church needs to face that. Are you talking like the Pope Church or like the Congregation Church? Both. I agree. And there are some among us here today who are going to go home and say, well, that was interesting. And they're not going to show up the next time. And so when you think about whether to show up that next time, think about what is Christian right now, right? When you know that all of this exists at once, what is the next right Christian thing to do? What else? I want to offer 3 invitations. The first is that if you're a person who worships at Pax Christi, there is a Justice Council. There is a land acknowledgement team. There are structures that are already in place, and they would love to have you and to continue this conversation. If you are a Christian person who is not at Pax Christi, I want to let you know about a resource called Sacred Reckonings that just came out today that is essentially a curriculum workbook for congregations to work through a reparations process and do this sort of truth-telling in a way that is structured and brings it to the congregation to talk about next steps. I've got cards if anybody wants to follow up with me, because you're going to actually want to need to figure out how to find it. And then the last invitation that I have for you is a new tool called the Minnesota Makoche Honor Tax. This is a tool that I created with the Lower Sioux Indian community where people can pay voluntary rent. We talked about how we are here on Dakota land. We can say that, but should we not also compensate for that, right? We took this in a capitalist framework. If we're not doing land back, what can we do in addition or instead? And the Lower Sioux Indian community was at the epicenter of both economic violence of the treaties and the violence of the Dakota War. So I have materials on that as well, but I want to be mindful of the time and let you all go. Thank you all so much for sharing this space with me and letting me quiz you and drill you and have this rich conversation. Thanks.
I want to thank you. I want to thank you, Jessica, for being here. It was just a wonderful conversation, really got me thinking. So anyway, I appreciate you being here. Thank you. Oh, yes. On April 22nd, which is Earth Day, we are having a retreat here, right here in the sanctuary. We'll be working with Care for Creation and the Justice Council. The person who will be here will be Sheldon Wolfchild and Stephen Newcomb. And Sheldon Wolfchild actually directed and wrote the Doctrine of Discovery. So he will be here, there'll be storytelling, and we'll have indigenous food, we'll have drumming, and prayer, and we'll have a timeline of the land that we live on. And we also have just created a land acknowledgement. So we'll be putting that out to the community. So we welcome you to come. Thank you.